Good evening. I'm Rebecca Robertson. I'm president and executive producer of Park Avenue Armory, and welcome tonight on this rainy night. Thank you all for coming out. We appreciate it. And with the UN in session, which we also really appreciate that you're here, so thank you. This is the first of our fall Malkin Lecture Series, and we're super excited about it. We are covering a lot of interesting topics in the Malkin Lectures this year, including tonight's on Walt Whitman, but also on Chester Arthur, which will be, I think, very interesting, Sergeant's Ladies. And then we're ending up with Prohibition, and I don't know what that says about where the Malkin Lectures are going, but I'm sure it'll be super interesting. We also have a pretty exciting fall coming up in the Drill Hall on October 1st, from October 1st to the 7th. It's the 6th Brandenburg Concertos. They're played by Bivouac, which is a Baroque orchestra from, very well-known Baroque orchestra from Europe. And the choreography is by Teresa de Kiersmacher, and it's going to be really something very special. And then we have a beautiful piece by William Kentridge that we commissioned with the 1418 Commission from England. And it is a music, dance, theater piece, just only the way that William Kentridge can do these incredible things. It has an amazing creative team and cast, and it looks at the million African porters who were either injured or died in World War I, working, carrying the goods of all the various warring factions. And it's a untold story, and it's so beautifully done. It opened at the Tate this summer and got 5-star reviews everywhere. So I really urge you to come and see that. We have recitals and talks and all sorts of things coming on. That we have the first meeting of the Lenape Nation, the first powwow in Manhattan, which you wouldn't think was a possibility, but in fact it is. And that's in November, and it'll be a meeting of all the Lenape elders from various states all around the country. So I think that's going to be an amazing thing. It's going to be in the drill hall, so it'll be with artifacts, and there'll be talks and dances, and it's going to be fabulous. So yet another thing to see. Our talk tonight is about one of America's most important poets, New Yorker Walt Whitman. He had connections into the Seventh Regiment, like everybody, frankly, of that period of an artistic band had. Some of his good friends were members here, including Thomas Nast, Fitz-James O'Brien, who was a poet, and the author Theodore Winthrop. He also witnessed and was affected by many of the militia's most impressive parades and marches, including the 1824 greeting of the Marquis de Lafayette. And we actually have a picture, a portrait of Marquis de Lafayette in one of our rooms at the other end of the building. And to the military escort of President Lincoln's coffin through the city 41 years later. I can think of no one better to discuss the cultural and social context of Walt Whitman's New York than Professor David Reynolds, author of Walt Whitman's America, winner of the Bancroft Prize and the Ambassador Book Award, and finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award. He is a distinguished professor of American literature and U.S. history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. David, please join us.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, and it's great to be in this very, very historic building. I had walked by it, but had actually never been inside it. I live out in Long Island, but it's an amazing place, really. And the Seventh Regiment is such an important factor in American history, really, along, obviously, with Walt Whitman, whose 200th anniversary of his birth is coming up next year. So you'll probably see a lot of Walt Whitman-related articles and so forth next year. It's a very important year for Walt Whitman, to be sure. Let's see, okay, there we are. In 1858, 3 years after the publication of the first edition of his landmark poetry volume, Leaves of Grass, and 3 years before the outbreak of the Civil War, the 39-year-old Brooklynite Walt Whitman, he used to take the ferry over from Brooklyn to Manhattan almost every day. He started frequenting Pfaff's restaurant and lager beer saloon in Manhattan FAFSA was located below a hotel lobby on Broadway just north of Bleecker. It was approached through a sidewalk hatch that opened onto metal stairs leading down to a room, a gaslit room. They had gas lighting back then. A table that sat 30 ran through the room. That was before the round tables were put in. A table that sat 30 ran through the room, which was lined on one side with wine casks. I think by this time, in the 1860s, they had wine bottles, but anyway. At the head of the table was Henry Clapp, a short, raspy-voiced man who made FAFSA a place of merriment and repartee for creative types, poets, novelists, journalists, actors, actresses, and others who were America's first bohemians. Now, Walt Whitman was not really a drinking person, but he would sort of nurse a glass of beer while everybody else got sort of drunk around him. He went there just to really talk and meet interesting people. I mean, that was his basic thing. He kind of looks like a bohemian in the late in the late 1850s, though, and he really liked the camaraderie and the stimulation. His spirits were a little bit down because the first two editions of Leaves of Grass hadn't had the greatest reception in the world, so he really enjoyed going to FAFSA and meeting interesting people. And members of the group there included, as Rebecca was mentioning, Fitz-James O'Brien, who was an Irish-born journalist and an author of weird fiction, sort of like Edgar Allan Poe's stories. Theodore Winthrop, a novelist and a poet, and Thomas Nast, who at the time was a teenager. This picture was later on, but at the time, but he was sort of in his late teens at the time. He later became America's leading cartoonist. And he was a very good artist, regular artist as well. He created the familiar roly-poly Santa Claus with the chimney, the Republican elephant, the Democratic donkey, among other, many other images. These three men were destined to have something in common. Other than just being friends with Walt Whitman, they all became members of the New York 7th Infantry Regiment, also called the National Guard. In the late 1850s, when Whitman and his friends were hanging out at FAFSA, the 7th Regiment was headquartered above shops and butchers on 3rd Avenue at Tompkins Market. The regiment's new headquarters, the beautiful building in which we're now, would come in 1880, but way back when, before Tompkins Market, the regiment had been at Central Park Armory on 5th Avenue. And so the 7th Regiment had some nice addresses. I think this is probably the best address. And it takes up a whole block. It's pretty incredible. During the Civil War, it had some fancy members. During the war, it was known as the Silk Stocking Regiment because it featured names like Vanderbilt, Tiffany, Van Buren, Gracie, and Hamilton. So it was the Silk Stocking Regiment. How about these three friends of Whitman? Theodore Winthrop joined the New York 7th Regiment only to become one of the first Union officers killed in the Civil War. He died of a bullet to the heart at the Battle of Big Bethel in June 1861. And the war had only begun in April, so it was pretty, soon after the beginning of the war. Fitz-James O'Brien eagerly signed up with the 7th Regiment, but he was severely wounded at a battle in February 1862, and he died of tetanus in Maryland 2 months later. Thomas Nast did not serve in the Civil War. He joined the 7th Regiment in 1866, a year after the war ended. Another friend of Whitman's, I don't have his picture here, but his name was William Swinton, and he wrote a wonderful history of the regiment called The History of the Seventh Regiment, National Guard, State of New York during the War of the Rebellion. It was published in 1870 with illustrations by Thomas Nast, and you know, it can be read online. I think you can actually buy a copy through Amazon, but it's really interesting. But tonight, I'm going to focus on Walt Whitman, America's greatest poet, and his relationship to the Seventh Regiment. And by considering Whitman and a special member of the regiment, who I'll mention in a moment, we learn a lot more about the Civil War, I think. The 7th Regiment had not always been called that. It originated in 1806. First it was called the 11th Regiment, and in the 1820s added the nickname the National Guard. It was actually named after Lafayette's National Guard in Paris. But anyway, the regiment gained its new number, the 7th, in the 1840s. So that was in the 1840s. And during the Civil War, its main activities were controlling riots at the time, such as the Astor Place riot in 1849, and during the Civil War, the draft riot here in New York City. And it held parades, as Rebecca was mentioning, such as the 1824 one for to welcome celebrities, such as Lafayette, who had been a Revolutionary War hero, and he toured America in 1824. Walt Whitman was a 6-year-old boy in Brooklyn at the time, and he met Lafayette, who actually picked him up and hugged him. Now, we don't know if Whitman saw the 7th Regiment at that time. I know that he saw Lafayette in Brooklyn, so I don't know if he actually saw the 7th, but he saw it later on. The regiment became world famous as a tightly disciplined unit that performed intricate exercises and marched in perfect formation. And Walt Whitman saw the regiment in a 4th of July parade in New York in the 1850s, and he wrote in a newspaper, "Here comes the 7th Regiment in their well-known gray. That's real marching. Close, straight, every musket sloped true and steady. With a front as even as a wall, they present a striking contrast to nearly every other portion of the procession." So he was really super impressed by the 7th Regiment. And here's our greatest poet looking at them. Now, he was thrilled by them. In general, in the late 1850s, he was a little bit down. I mentioned the first 2 editions of Leaves of Grass had received a couple of great notices, one from Emerson, who called it the most magnificent piece of wit and wisdom America has yet produced. And Emerson was right, absolutely. However, most of the reviews have been quite negative. The people at that time really couldn't understand his kind of experimental poetry, and some of it was candidly frank about the body and all of that. And that's one reason why he would spend time at FAFSA, just to kind of relax and have fun. He was also writing he kept writing poetry, and he came out with a wonderful 3rd edition of Leaves of Grass in 1860. So he was still very, very creative at that time. Meanwhile, tensions over slavery were growing, and there was already talk of war between the North and the South. Whitman saw the storm of war coming, and so did a member, this is the man I was mentioning earlier, our special guest, a member of the 7th Regiment, the artist Sanford Gifford. Now, he was the leading artist of the Hudson River School. The founder of the school was Thomas Cole, and other members were Asher Durand, Frederick Edwin Church, and John Frederick Kensett. And they're all just marvelous painters, artists. Their paintings are generally landscapes that show nature in realistic detail, and they often have a mystical glow. Walt Whitman in his poetry was very much influenced by Hudson River painters and their style. But as the Civil War approached, both Gifford's paintings and Whitman's poems got darker. The painter and the poet projected the tensions that would soon tear the nation apart and cause the bloodiest war in the nation's history, the Civil War, which broke out in 1861 and lasted until the spring of 1865. And when you look at this painting called Twilight in the Catskills, produced just before the war by Gifford, it seems to be almost suffused with the color of blood. It's sunset here, almost like the sunset of the old American nation, which was dying with the coming of the war. There's an eerie stillness to the scene, and the clouds seem to portend a storm. In the foreground are leafless, blasted trees, and even the distant hills look bare and treeless. The painting captures some of the gloom and uneasiness that many Americans just before the war felt. And these are feelings that Whitman captured in this poem. Might not be too easy to read the writing, so I'll read it to you. Year that trembled and reeled beneath me, your summer wind was warm enough, yet the air I breathed froze me. A thick gloom fell through the sunshine and darkened me. Must I change my triumphant songs? Said I to myself. Must I indeed learn to chant the cold dirges of the baffled and the sullen hymns of defeat? There was a lot of tension in the air at that moment. Now, when the war finally came, however, gloom was replaced by excitement. War fever seized the nation. Lincoln called up 75,000 troops in April 1861, and among the very first to respond was the New York Seventh Regiment. And this is a painting by Nast, who I mentioned earlier, and was a wonderful artist. The Seventh Regiment would play an important role in American history. Lincoln was, yes, installed as president now, but 11 southern states had left the Union, so the nation was sort of divided. Washington, D.C., where Lincoln was under threat. Located in the South, flanked by Maryland and Virginia, it was increasingly encircled by Southern troops. If the nation's capital fell to the South, the war would have been quickly over in the South's favor. Now, a Massachusetts regiment struggled to get to Washington and made it there, but on the way it was attacked by a rebel mob in Baltimore, so it lost some members. Many more troops were needed, and the 7th Regiment responded. It was 1,000 strong, and it marched down Broadway, cheered by tens of thousands of people who lined the streets and hung out windows as the flags whipped and the handkerchiefs filled the air. And Nast, I think, captures this the excitement pretty well in this oil painting. Now, had Walt Whitman come over from Brooklyn to watch this dramatic departure? He didn't leave a record of it, but it was the kind of event he loved. Whitman saw the war as a healthy cloudburst, like a storm that promised to clear the atmosphere. He captured the excitement of that moment in this poem, which I think kind of goes along with the painting. Thunder on, stride on, democracy, strike with vengeful stroke. And do you rise higher than ever yet, O days, O cities, crash heavier, heavier yet, O storms, you have done me good. My soul, prepared in the mountains, absorbs your immortal, strong nutriment. I have witnessed the true lightning, I have witnessed my cities electric. I have lived to behold man burst forth, and warlike America rise. Hence I will seek no more the food of northern solitary wilds, nor on the mountains roam or sail the stormy sea. So he kind of shared the excitement of that particular moment. So the 7th Regiment went from New York to Jersey City, where there was another big celebration, as there was when they went to Philadelphia. They went by train to Philadelphia. From there, they wanted to go south through Baltimore to kind of repay the rebels for their attack on that Massachusetts regiment, but the railroads and bridges had been destroyed. So they took a ship to Annapolis, and from there they marched 20 miles to the District of Columbia. Their reception was enthusiastic. They were among the earliest troops to arrive, and with other units that came after them, they saved the capital. And here is the 7th Regiment in Washington at their camp. No one was happier than President Lincoln, who reviewed the 7th Regiment and deployed it for 60 days. Over the next 3 years, the regiment had several tours of duty. It served mainly in the Washington area and in Maryland. It was not commissioned for any of the major battles like Gettysburg or Antietam. Some said that the silk-stocking soldiers from elite families must not be exposed to too much danger. But the regiment did see action, and it had its casualties, such as Theodore Winthrop and Fitz-James O'Brien. And it produced some of the best art of the Civil War, some of the best paintings. Sanford Gifford went on 3 tours of duty with the regiment between 1861 and 1863. He took his sketchbook and some art equipment with him, and he produced some marvelous paintings. There are 3 of them in the right-hand hall as you enter there, called the anyway, they're hanging there, and I'll discuss a couple of them today, but there are 3 kind of Civil War paintings of the 7th Regiment. And they're not really pictures of battle, and this was really interesting because Walt Whitman, even though he knew the Civil War and its violence very well, because his brother George was in virtually every major Civil War battle, he was wounded at Fredericksburg, and Whitman went down there and saw over 100,000 soldiers who were dying, well, either dying or very severely wounded in the Civil War hospital. So he knew, Walt Whitman knew about the violence of the Civil War, but he preferred really to write poems about the long, long days between battles, the time of the camp life, the time in the camps and the marches and the sentries and that kind of thing. And Sanford Gifford was really kind of the same way, even though he saw some action as well, but still, and he lost a brother in the war and everything, but still he preferred to catch these kind of the average life of, and this is one of the paintings in the front room. Here we see the 7th century. It's called, my eyesight is bad. The camp of the 7th Regiment near Frederick, Maryland. So that was in Maryland, and you know, they stopped and put up their shelters and everything. And there were bivouac. Now, bivouacking means when they set up their camps, and they would sleep there for nights, sometimes weeks. They would just stay there, and they would wait there for the next battle. And here we see the soldiers in activities like cooking by a campfire, and some are setting up their shelters, and others are gazing into the distance. The clothing left out to dry in the shelters adds a counterpoint to the American flag. I don't know if you can see it, but it's, right there on one of the shelters, a reminder of the patriotic cause that they're fighting for. And Gifford couldn't resist putting himself into the painting. It's kind of hard to see, but on the lower left, there's a gentleman who's there doing a sketch. He's smoking a pipe. This was the kind of daily Army camp scene that Walt Whitman liked to describe, as in this poem called Bivouac on a Hillside. I see before me now a traveling army halting. Below, a fertile valley spread with barns and the orchards of summer. Behind, the terraced sides of a mountain, abrupt in places, rising high, broken with rocks, with clinging cedars, with tall shapes dingily seen. The numerous campfires scattered near and far, some away up on the mountain. The shadowy forms of men and horses looming, large size flickering, and over all the sky, far, far out of reach. It gives a kind of similar feeling, I think. Another quiet moment in the war that Gifford captures is in this painting. I think it's in the front room as well. I'm not sure. Well, no, I guess it's not. Anyway, but it's about the 7th Regiment listening to a preacher. at camp. They've come back and they're listening to a preacher. And the main colors here are shades of green, suggesting the fecundity of nature, which is meant to reflect the refreshment that the troops are receiving from the preacher's words. The preacher's pulpit is draped with the American flag, again the patriotic symbol of the Northern cause. The Northerners at the time were very proud of their flag because, it wasn't the Confederate flag. So the flag became sort of a big symbol. And there's a sense of promise in the distant vista of the city below with its smokestacks and beyond the blue harbor, with the sky above giving a kind of mystical glow. Although Whitman didn't write about a Sunday scene in wartime, there are passages in his war poems that try to convey a sense of fertility and peace, such as Green. This was, again, a poem about war, but he... Green the midsummer verdure, the fresh blows, the dallying breeze, o'er the proud and peaceful cities, the arm of the sea between. Drill and parade are over, they march back to the quarters, only hear that approval of hands, hear what a clapping as wending the crowds now part and disperse, but we, old man, not for nothing have I brought you hither, we must remain, you to speak in your turn and I to listen until. So it's about a crowd listening to an older man, in this case an old soldier, but in the painting, of course, it's a preacher. Now, Whitman made much of comradely affection, which he thought could help resolve the tensions behind the Civil War, and there's a sense of comradeship in the painting. The men are in a circle around the preacher, some standing, others lounging on the grass, a few looking at each other, and chatting. There's a peaceful, comradely atmosphere, so distant from the violence of battle, that makes me think of lines like this at the bottom of the screen there. Over the carnage rose a prophetic voice, be not disheartened, affection shall solve the problems of freedom, yet those who love each other shall become invincible. They shall yet make Columbia victorious, Columbia meaning America. They will make America victorious. Now, a far darker atmosphere pervades this Gifford painting of the 7th Regiment. Now, this is in the front room. At night, camping at Arlington Heights, Virginia. It's not a battle scene, but it has the feel of battle. The orange-yellow flame of the campfire seems to send billowing smoke, billowing blackness upwards, as though the smoke from the fire is mingling with the tree above it. The small-sized soldiers looking at the fire are dwarfed by the encircling dusky blackness of the forest around them. The moonlight is dispersed by a whitish haze that has a kind of ghastly look. If you squint, you almost see a skull with the moon as its left eye, the patch of blue on the other side as its right eye, and the orange semicircle in the lower middle, its grinning mouth, with the soldiers almost looking like teeth. Have to have imagination to see that, but Whitman sometimes captures this ominous feelings in his war poems, as in this one about a nighttime camp. A bivouac is just a camp. By the bivouac's fitful flame, a procession winding round me, solemn and sweet, slow and sure, but first I note the tents of the sleeping army, the fields and woods dim outline, the darkness, lit spots of kindled fire, the silence like a phantom far or near, an occasional figure moving, the shrubs and trees. As I left, my eyes, they seemed to be stealthily watching me, talking about the trees, while wind in procession thoughts, oh, tender and wondrous thoughts of life and death, of home and the past and loved, and those that are far away, a solemn and slow procession there as I sit on the ground by the bivouac's fitful flame. It's really a marvelous poem. And it kind of has a similar sort of almost Gothic feeling to the painting. Now, two of Sanford Gifford's brothers died early in the war, one by suicide, another while trying to escape from a Confederate prison camp. And also the Seventh Regiment had a number of losses, and the death toll of the whole Civil War would reach around 750,000, which was more American deaths than in all other wars combined. And Gifford projected some of his feelings in a painting of 1863 called A Coming Storm. It is an autumn scene. The impending death that autumn often symbolizes in art is captured here, both in the pallid color of the sky, like a corpse, and in the overarching black cloud that creates a kind of grim, dark halo over the landscape. The soft brilliance of the orange trees is shattered by the bleak spikes of two bare rocks that thrust upward, almost like two monuments or gravestones, perhaps symbolizing the two brothers that Gifford had lost. I don't know if you can see all of that from your perspective, but it's a beautiful painting. And for commentary on the painting, I turn not to Whitman, but to another author of that time, Melville, Herman Melville. Melville wrote war poems as well, and one poem was inspired by this particular Gifford painting. And Melville was aware of the unusual history of the painting. It had been bought by the most famous actor of the day, Edwin Booth. And looking at the dark implications of the painting in April 1865, the month that Lincoln was killed, Melville came to the realization it was Edwin Booth's actor brother John Wilkes Booth who had killed Lincoln. Now for Melville, it was a kind of spooky coincidence that Edwin Booth owned the painting, which with its dark cloud could be said to have anticipated the assassination of the nation's president by Booth's brother. Edwin Booth was a wonderful Shakespearean actor who specialized in Hamlet, and Melville put Hamlet into the poem. And I'll just read the poem. The Coming Storm. This is the Melville, a picture, this is all written by Melville. A picture by S.B. Gifford and owned by E.B. E.B. is Edwin Booth. Included in the NA, I think that's the North American exhibition, I think it was in New York. April 1865, that's the month that Lincoln was killed. So Melville really locates us. A demon cloud like the mountain one. The demon cloud is John Wilkes Booth. Burst on a spirit as mild, that's Lincoln. Burst on a spirit as mild as this urned lake, the home of ashes. Lincoln's mild, deep spirit symbolized by the lake. This is all Melville's perception of the painting. But Shakespeare's pensive child, this is Edwin Booth, who really knew Shakespeare really, really well. Never the lines had lightly scanned. He hadn't read Shakespeare lightly. The Hamlet in his heart was aware. Such hearts can antedate. And he's saying, when he bought this painting, maybe he didn't even really know it, but maybe he sensed it because he knew Shakespeare so well. And he antedated almost what his brother was going to do. No utter surprise can come to him who reaches Shakespeare's core. That which we seek and shun is there, man's final lore. So Melville valued above all what he called the power of blackness in Shakespeare. Those deep, faraway things in him, those short, quick probings at the very axis of reality. That's what Melville said about Shakespeare. And the fact that Melville saw these Shakespearean qualities in Gifford's painting, I think, says a lot. In the poem, he says that Shakespeare is man's final lore, that is to say, the last word about the human condition. Kind of the way, I guess, Beethoven is to classical music or something like that. Shakespeare is to writing. He's suggesting that the wickedness of Shakespeare's murderous villains was equaled by Edwin Booth's brother, who killed Lincoln, a spirit as mild as this lake in Gifford's painting, which is overshadowed by the demon cloud. Now, Once the Civil War was over, Gifford again thought about it and projected it in this painting, Hunter Mountain Twilight. The foreground of the painting is quite stark. There's nothing but the dying trunks of trees that have been cut and taken away. We could see these absent trees as the fallen soldiers of the Civil War, once lying as corpses on the battlefields or in hospitals, but now gone, and the rocks on the field almost look like tombstones, remembrances perhaps of the Civil War dead. But this was done the year after the Civil War was ended. But notice that there's life too. There's the man, I don't know if you can see him, but he's kind of small, standing kind of in the middle left of the painting there. With the cattle in front of him. Again, it's kind of hard to see the cattle, but there are cattle in front of him, his back to us, and he's kind of looking into the horizon. And below him to the right, there's a kind of a homey cottage with the lights on, and there's a barn beside the cottage, and behind the cottage there are these beautiful green trees, and the purple mountain behind it, and then the kind of yellowish sky, and it could almost be sunrise rather than sunset. And the old nation is gone, but perhaps a new one is coming. And the scene really is quite beautiful. The poet John Keats wrote famously, "Beauty is truth, truth beauty. That is all you know on earth and all you need to know." And he was writing about a Grecian urn, and he's basically saying, look, all the businesses and governments and tradesmen and people of ancient Greece have gone. They're gone. But we have beauty, this Grecian urn. That's what lasts over time. Truth is beauty, or we have the temples of ancient Greece and so forth. And the beauty of art, that is what remained for Sanford Gifford, who kept producing wonderful paintings until his death in 1880. He really lived, 15 years beyond the Civil War. And Whitman produced matchless poems until his passing in 1892. And Melville kept writing mainly poetry, some fiction, but mainly poetry until his death in 1891. So, they all remain creative and productive. The French author Mallarmé wrote, "To end up in a beautiful book, that is what the world is made for." And I think we can revise that. Let's say, to end up in a beautiful artwork, a book, a painting, musical composition, or another form of art, that is what the world is made for. Certainly Sanford Gifford, Walt Whitman, and Herman Melville left us all a heritage of beauty in their works, and the experience of the Seventh Regiment in the Civil War had much to do with that. Thank you. Are there any questions or comments? Yes?
What was Whitman's decision-making around service in combat? He was a nurse, right? He didn't serve in combat. How did he come to...
Yeah, Walt Whitman, what happened in 1862, Fredericksburg was a very bad battle, and Whitman was in Brooklyn. He lived in Brooklyn, and he saw the list of the wounded, because they would put lists, and he saw his brother George there, and said, oh my goodness, He didn't really know how badly wounded that George was, but he went down there. Fortunately, it was just a cheek wound, and George recovered and went on and fought in many major battles. But Whitman stayed in Washington, and he remained there as a volunteer nurse. And this is what really made Whitman famous in his own time as the good gray poet, someone who was a volunteer nurse. He would give candy or little trinkets or something to the soldiers. A lot of them were dying or were wounded, and he would care for them. He would read to them whatever they liked, whether it be the Bible or whether it be poetry or whether whatever. And he saw over 100,000 of these soldiers. So he did work for the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but he actually got fired because the guy, his boss, found his poetry and had little sexuality in there. So got rid of them. But I mean, some of Whitman's poetry is quite frank. In certain places, it's quite frank. I wouldn't call it sort of pornographic or anything, but anyway. But he kept on, and he took on kind of odd jobs, and he was really, really selfless. He would go at least twice a day and care for these soldiers. It was quite brave of him, and also quite kind of him, I think, to do that. Yeah. Yes.
Well, we know that certainly not all New Yorkers were as loyal as the Seventh Regiment to the concept of fighting the Civil War. Can you talk about the draft riots?
Yeah, well, the draft riots occurred in 1863, and the deal was that if you paid $300, you could get yourself out of it, or you could hire a substitute. And so it seemed at the time like a war just to be fought by the underprivileged people who couldn't afford. Well, in those days, $300 was a lot of money. I mean, yeah. And so there was a big riot, waged by a lot of underprivileged, white people in New York who were drafted, and unfortunately, they took out their anger and frustration at African Americans, and there was a lot of lynching and all that stuff. So the Seventh Regiment was one of the ones that was called in to sort of control the situation. It was a terrible, terrible riot. Lasted for several days. They burned, buildings and houses and everything like that. Yeah. So, but then the Seventh Regiment came in and they kind of settled everything, and other troops came in as well, and they kind of governed the situation. And it was really the last major riot of the Civil War. But it was a frustration over the draft. Yeah. And yeah. Yeah, he went there in '63, and he stays there until after the Civil War. So right into 1866. And yeah, what were you going to say? Yeah.
I guess my second question, did he have any direct interaction with Lincoln?
Well, he said that he saw Lincoln almost every day on the street, because Lincoln would go back and forth with his carriage. And he said that one time they bowed to each other, but they never really met personally. They never met. But he gained an incredible respect for Lincoln, and then he wrote wonderful poems about Lincoln, one called "O Captain, My Captain," which is wonderful, a beautiful poem, and another one called "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed," and which is a beautiful, beautiful sort of lovely poem about Lincoln's death. So yeah, but he never met him. But he spent much of the rest of his life giving lectures about Lincoln, because a friend of his had been in the theater when Lincoln was killed. So this friend told him all the details of what happened in the theater that evening, and he would give this lecture called "The Death of Abraham Lincoln," and he made a fair amount of money. From it, and he was asked so often to repeat his poem, "O Captain, My Captain," which is a great poem. If you haven't read that, you should read that. But he got tired of it. He said, "Damn my captain." I said, "I'm sick of my captain." He was talking about the poem, not about Lincoln. But it's kind of like a song you've heard a little too often or something like that, But it's a beautiful poem, and the Lilacs one is just unbelievable. It's just gorgeous, gorgeous poem. He wrote four poems about Lincoln, and those I think are his two best ones. Yeah. And any other questions, either about Whitman or? I don't pretend to be an expert on Gifford. Although I just like his paintings, and that's all I can say. It's funny that the paintings, when you see them, look kind of small, and you have to kind of look very closely. If you have to look very closely to see some of the details, but they're incredible details. Wow, Yeah.
So the end of his life, he returned here to New York?
No. Well, after the Civil War, he came back to Brooklyn, but then he suffered the first of a series of strokes in 1873. And he went down to Camden, New Jersey, which at the time was kind of a rising place. It wasn't, whatever. Nowadays, it's a little bit less than that, but at the time, it was kind of an up-and-coming place. His brother George lived there, and he wanted to be near George, and he went down there, and George helped, and his family helped take care of him down there. And he lived the rest of his life in Camden, New Jersey. He died in 1892, and he's buried in Camden. And his gravestone just says Walt Whitman, and he brought all his family members, had them dug up, and brought them all to be buried under the tomb. But it only says Walt Whitman, even though the other family members are there. Yeah. But, he said he felt fairly tribal about his family. He felt very close, even though none of them particularly cared for his poetry. One of them just sort of leafed through it and said, well, all right. Yeah. And then, wealth? No. Oh, no. What? Oh, well, late in life, when unfortunately he was confined to, a chair, he had a series of strokes. And anyway, he was confined to a chair. And by that time, he had become like world famous. Oscar Wilde came, and Longfellow came, and this person came, and everything. But he was kind of sitting there, and he wasn't depressed. He was not. He says, "I stand for the cheerful conclusions." That's what he said. I stand for the cheerful conclusions. And I think a lot of people, maybe sitting in his situation, might get depressed. He refused to get depressed, even though he could. Well, he had to be pushed around, in a wheelchair and all that kind of thing. But by that time, he was famous, and there was a Walt Whitman cigar, and there was a Walt Whitman tree, and a Walt Whitman this, and nowadays there's a Walt Whitman turnoff of the New Jersey Turnpike, and there's a Walt Whitman mall out in Huntington and everything. So, yeah, he became a celebrity, but he never really, Andrew Carnegie, who was a wealthy man at that time, helped to support him a little bit, and he would often put on these events where Walt Whitman would be rolled in his wheelchair, and he would talk about the death of Abraham Lincoln. And he'd make a certain amount of money, but he never made much money at all. Yeah. But, poets a lot of days don't, even today, don't make necessarily that much money. But, yeah.
I know that Walt Whitman, of course, would be considered gay in today's society, as well as Herman Melville. Was Sanford Gifford, did he love men as well?
That's a good question. Does anyone know about Sanford Gifford's wife? I don't believe he was ever married, so I'm not really sure. That's really interesting. I'd like to look into that, yeah. Because Whitman, of course, wrote his Calamus poems, and he had his passionate relationship. We don't really know exactly about the relationships, and he always called it just sort of comradeship and all of that, and at the end of his life, he denied. It was kind of a different atmosphere, because the word homosexual wasn't used until the year of his death. It wasn't used in English. It was used in German in 1869, but it wasn't used in English till 1892. And the general public didn't know the word until the 1920s when the New York Times used it. So he saw himself in terms of this comradely love and everything like that. Although reading into his poetry, it's pretty clear that he loved men. And even though he sort of denied it when John Addington Symonds approached him late in life and asked him about it, he said, no, my life has been jolly bodily. I've had 6 children. He didn't have any children. He said, I've had, no. When I had this sweetheart and all that, so anyway, yeah. But that's really interesting. I'm not sure about Sanford Gifford. Yeah. Any other questions? No? I guess that's about it. So, thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.